Genie Scott is an American physical anthropologist who has been the executive director of the National Center for Science Education, NCSE, since 1987. She is a leading critic of young Earth creation and intelligent design, and is one of my heroes. Let's welcome Genie Scott.
I guess we're on now, thank you. Sorry for the technical difficulties. Is there a slide that we can show at this point? Thank you. I know it works now. Well, this is going to be a two-handed job, so this is going to be sort of, well, thank you very much Bruce, for inviting me to be part of your conference. I always look forward to being able to talk about the creationism and evolution controversy. Now, the theme of your conference is the hazards of living in a religious world, and indeed it is certainly a religious world. According to data from the Britannica, these data are from the last decade, the vast majority of people on the planet do have religious beliefs, the largest single group of whom are Christians. Non-believers in these data, rounding up, is about 15%, which is approximately what it is actually in the United States. And yes, there definitely are hazards of living in a religious world. Some practitioners are quite firm about everyone agreeing with them. And actually, the Southern Baptists are comparatively benign compared to some interpreters of Islam. If you give up your Southern Baptist identification, they don't execute you. But even if there are hazards of living in a religious world, you must admit that there is some entertainment value. We can only hope that God takes off for spelling. I suppose some of you sitting very far back cannot see dictate, dominate, devastate the world for God, with devastate having a somewhat creative spelling there. And there's often a charming cluelessness to these dumb church signs that you just have to appreciate. Someone with a little more internet savvy might have, shall we say, suggested a different ordering of these banners. Now, and believe me, I'm not going to comment on this one at all. But when it... But when it comes to the, yeah, it took some of you quite a long time to figure that one. Anyway, but when it comes to the teaching of evolution, living in a religious world has mixed effects. And maybe I can illustrate this with a little bit of history. I really firmly do believe that you can't understand why you are where you are today if you don't know where you've been in the past. So I want to talk a little bit about a very substantial change, really, in Western orientation toward the natural world as well as the supernatural world, of which Darwin was certainly a part. People always think of Darwin, sorry, two-handed here. People always think of Darwin when they think of evolution, and obviously Darwin presented the clearest version of evolution On the Origin of Species. But tonight I want to talk about how Darwin and evolution were part of a profound revolution in Western culture, both looking at nature and at the place of human beings in it. And I want to focus this evening on Darwin's contribution to this paradigm shift, not only in Western culture, but also in Christian religion. This involved a shift seeing the world as changing rather than static, and of replacing, at least to some degree, supernatural causes with natural causes. These changes in worldview began long before Darwin, but arguably his contributions were the most profound. I want to take a look at these shifts and Darwin's contributions to them. The world of the ancient Hebrews and most other ancient civilizations, there's Aristotle's universe there on the left, was conceived of as being static. If you take a look at this Hebrew conception of the universe, you see a flat earth shaped like a nickel. It was round. You know, the Bible talks about the circle of the earth. It doesn't talk about the sphere of the earth. The earth is a flat disk, basically, to the ancients. And also, you notice that there are these, the foundations of heaven supporting a dome, the firmament of heaven. But notice especially that the sun and the moon and the stars are underneath the firmament. The classical Hebraic version of the cosmology of the universe is geocentric. The earth is the center of the universe. And the world was as we see it today as it was in the beginning of time, according to the ancient Hebrews. And it was the result of supernatural special creation. The diversity of languages in the world, for example, is explained by God having caused confusion in tongues during the building of the Tower of Babel. Linguists, of course, explain the diversity of languages using natural causes, but for most of human history, phenomena that we explain through natural causes were given supernatural explanations. The Christian doctrine of special creationism, for example, takes the point of view that God created. Of course, all Christians believe that God created, but special creation is a particular view about how God created. And in special creation, God creates everything in its present form. This is the classical stasis view of reality. And kinds of organisms are created with limited genetic variability. Of course, the idea of evolution is that living things share common ancestry. This is in direct contradiction to special creationism. In the most common form of special creation, that of biblical Genesis, everything is created at one time in the 6 24-hour days of Genesis. And there was little challenge to the accepted view of stasis and special creation up through the Middle Ages. By about 1500, the world was still perceived as unchanging. It was a static universe that was still pretty much as God had created it. The Earth was not necessarily flat, but it still took a while to recognize that the solar system was not geocentric. Galileo in the 1630s proposed his ideas, of course, with not great results immediately, but by the end of the century, heliocentrism was not viewed as being unbiblical, although actually geocentrism was more of a Greek idea than a biblical one, but the Hebrews, of course, incorporated a lot of Greek scholarship as well. The static special creation view had arguably its greatest challenge in the age of exploration. If you remember your history, beginning in the 1500s, Europeans spread out around the globe and explored the literally new world of North and South America, the continent of Australia, the Pacific Islands, and more thoroughly explored sub-Saharan Africa. Well, they discovered a huge number of plants and animals during the 1500s to the 1800s, many of which were not described in the Bible. So what does this mean? Does this mean the Bible is not a perfect book? It is not a complete book. The discovery of large bones of creatures that were certainly closely related to living forms, but were no longer around, the idea of extinction also was kind of a shock, because that wasn't expected with a literal interpretation of the Bible as well. Did God create the odd marsupials in Australia only? Furthermore, there were what would later be called biogeographic problems. How do you get the animals of North and South America or Australia from Mount Ararat in the Middle East after the Ark landed? Because after the Ark lands, of course, all the animals have to spread out from that one place to these new worlds. And so the age of exploration and discovery really did cause a considerable theological re-evaluation, shall we say, of the Bible, because stuff in the Bible just didn't really work. And what about people? The explorers encountered lots of different people that also were not described in the Bible. Pacific Islanders, American, North and South Native Americans, the people of Australia, New Guinea, and so forth. These people were never mentioned in the Bible. These lands were never mentioned in the Bible. there were lots of theological difficulties that were generated by this age of exploration. The Catholic Church went through a long discussion about whether Native Americans were children of Adam and Eve. This was important because if they were children of Adam and Eve, then they could be saved, they could have souls, and they could not be enslaved. And so this was quite an important decision that the Catholic Church made, both for obviously political reasons as well as historical ones. In 1600, Newton proposed that God was grander for working through natural law rather than by directly intervening in nature to make the universe operate. The kind of standing argument was that the planets went around the sun because the angels were pushing them or God willed them or something. Newton felt that he was glorifying God by coming up with the laws that God had created to make the universe work. A God that worked through created laws was more worthy of worship than a God that was constantly intervening. And Newton, because he was not only the most brilliant scientific mind of his time, and maybe some would argue of all times, he was a pretty bright guy in general. He was also incredibly devout. There was never any problem with Newton's views on religion. He was a very orthodox Christian. And so his effort to communicate an idea that was not invented by him certainly, but definitely put on the map in terms of Christian theology, that God worked through secondary laws, was a very profound difference from God constantly intervening. And of course, the problem of when and how does God intervene, considering he created all of these laws that make the universe tick, became a very interesting theological issue also. God is omnipotent in the traditional Christian view, so certainly he can interfere. He can intervene in nature. He can produce miracles. But the whole notion of natural law and God breaking his own laws just sort of was a theological problem. So the idea of an economy of miracles, as they called it, the idea that God would not intervene very much, that God would pretty much create the laws and then let the universe tick along, was pretty standard theology. On the other hand, this was a lot easier to do when you're dealing with things like stars and planets. Then came the geologists. So let's skip that. Then came the geologists of the 1700s, who began to really explore the crust of the earth and the extensive mapping done especially by the British and continental geologists, studying the effect of wind and water, and Charles Lyell, whose picture is up there on the left, developing the idea of uniformitarianism, that the same kinds of processes of erosion and building up of sediments and so forth that we see operating today also operated in the past. Seems like a pretty easy idea, but it was pretty profound when you weren't used to thinking that way. But the geologists also were able to infer from their discoveries that the Earth was a great deal older than 6,000 years. And this was, remember, in the 1700s and early 1800s, that this idea of a young 6,000-year-old universe, Bishop Ussher calculating from the Bible the age of the Earth, this began to be set aside. It wasn't really as important. Again, it's not as important when you're dealing with things like stars and planets, and when you're dealing with things like rocks and rivers and physical science. Then, of course, well, just to summarize, by about 1800, Newton had established the idea pretty well in both science and accepted by Christianity that the universe operated by regularities or laws. And in the theological world, the idea that God worked through these created natural laws and basically didn't intervene except for very specified miracles. In other words, science was something that was possible, that could be done. Then, of course, came Darwin. And this intellectual climate in which the idea that the Earth was very old, that there were regularities or laws by which the universe operated, and science was kind of okay with that, it's a lot touchier when you're dealing with living things, when you're dealing with Darwin's idea that living things, rather than having been statically created and remaining the same since that creation time, actually had descended with modification, as he called it. There had been transmutation, was the term that they used back in the mid to late 1800s. There had been changes. It was not a static, living things were not static. There had been changes that took place in living things, just as there had been changes that took place in the crust of the earth. So the idea of evolution was prominent on the Origin of Species, the idea that living things were not static, they had descended with modification from common ancestors. And the other big idea in Origin of Species was that natural selection, his mechanism of change, explained these things. By the way, these are two independent ideas. The evidence that Darwin used to infer common ancestry is very different from the evidence that he used to infer natural selection as the main mechanism. And in fact, historically, the idea of common ancestry, the big idea of evolution, was accepted decades before the mechanism of natural selection. Natural selection really didn't become a serious, it did not become accepted as a serious and important evolutionary mechanism until the early third, the middle of the 20th century, after the discovery of first Mendelian genetics and then molecular genetics. But the idea of transmutation, there we go. The idea of transmutation meant that one species could turn into another. And of course, Darwin, as someone who looked a lot at domesticated animals, understood a lot about pigeons and dogs and cows and other creatures, also recognized that in nature it was very difficult to distinguish between varieties, such as breeds of cows or dogs or horses, and the species that supposedly were the created and immutable varieties. And so that pretty much made it very, very difficult to accept the idea of created kinds. Now, I mentioned to you also that Darwin's had the idea of the mechanism of natural selection. Natural selection is a not terribly complicated idea. It's adaptive differential reproduction is the classical biological definition of it. By reproduction, what we mean is that it has to do with passing on your genes. Darwin, of course, didn't know anything about genes, but he certainly knew that characteristics were passed on generation after generation. It's differential reproduction because some characteristics, some genes are passed on and others aren't. They are passed on differentially. Some are passed on in greater or lesser frequencies. And the big idea of natural selection is all of this is adaptive, because the characteristics that are passed on differentially are the ones that allow that species to survive longer, do better in that particular environment. It's not a long range or permanent kind of thing. It really is for the here and now. But this was a very different view of how it is that organisms seem to fit their particular environments. The standard explanation of why you had this fit of organisms to their environments, why the gazelle had long legs in order to flee the predator, why the predator had sharp claws and teeth in order to capture the gazelle, that had been explained primarily from the idea of design, that God had specially given the gazelle long legs and given the tiger sharp teeth. I guess tigers don't really eat cheetahs. Tigers live in Asia, gazelles live in Africa. Never mind. You know the old Tarzan movies where they've got a tiger with Tarzan and the chimp. Wrong. Tigers don't live there, but it's another. Just a little natural history things that fuss us around a little bit. And of course, a classic example of differential reproduction is the case of the peppered moth, where one color variety, the light-colored variety, is very easy to pick out on a dark background, whereas the dark variety shows up much more readily on a light background, and populations of moths living in environments where the backgrounds differ, the substratum differ, tend to fall prey to birds more frequently than others. I had a little video that I was going to show you, but I'm going to have to just skip that because I'm not connected here, so we'll just move right along here. The idea of design was closely associated with really an old Aristotelian idea that was also picked up in Christian theology called the great chain of being. The idea that you could take all of nature and rank it from the simplest worm, for example, to the more complex. So simple invertebrates would be lower on the great chain of being than more complicated invertebrates. Simple, quote, simple vertebrates like fish would be lower on the chain than more complicated ones like amphibians, and you have reptiles and simple mammals and more complicated mammals, and of course you get all the way up to the pinnacle of evolution pinnacle of creation, pardon me. You know, you should all laugh at that because that's your governor, okay. Previous governor, but nonetheless. Emerson has a poem, May Day, which you all read when you were kids in high school and possibly in college. And it just goes to show how even in the 1800s, the idea of the great chain of being still permeated culture and literature and so forth. And Emerson wrote, "The subtle chain of countless rings the next unto the farthest brings, and striving to be men, the worm mounts through all the spires of form." These spires of form, I mean, that's a great example of the great chain of being. Well, of course, the great chain of being, the idea of design, the idea of special creation, all of those ideas that were so central to the static and especially created view of the universe and of organisms were strongly challenged by Darwin. Of course, the idea of evolution itself, of common ancestry, challenged a literal view of the Bible. Certainly, it is directly in opposition to the idea of special creation of species. The two are simply incompatible ideas. But also the view of God as the direct creator. God is not designing stuff to fit the environment. Creatures do fit their environments. Structures, gazelles have long legs, they're prey species, but it's because of natural selection and common ancestry. Then there's another problem that evolution exacerbates. Now, this is the problem of theodicy. The problem of theodicy is the problem of evil. Why is there so much suffering? Why do we have the destruction of cities with tsunamis? And why do we have things like starvation and poverty and death and hunger and blood guts and nasty, brutish, and short? I mean, why is the world such a difficult place? If God is omniscient, omnipotent, and also all good, if he is omnibenevolent, how could we have so much pain and suffering in the world? Now, theodicy is a problem that Christians have wrestled with since the beginning of Christianity. It is not something that suddenly appeared because of the idea of evolution through natural selection. But it's exacerbated, shall we say, by the idea of evolution. Now, biblical literalists have a way out. Okay? Biblical literalists say that the reason for all of the death and suffering and unhappiness and terrible stuff that happens in the world to human beings and animals is because of the sin of Adam and Eve. So God gets off the hook. But what's better appreciated outside of the United States, which happens to have an unusually conservative form of Christianity, the majority of Christian denominations are not biblically literalists. But the biblical literalists are very clear about evolution not being accepted. In this cartoon panel from Answers in Genesis, the first panel says, "Did God use evolution?" Which, of course, is the Catholic and mainstream Protestant standard interpretation of science and religion. God created through evolution. There's all sorts of variants of what's called theistic evolution. Biblical literalists don't like this at all. Did God lose evolution? Did our Creator use a process that requires millions of years of death and brutal killing and survival of the fittest until finally God saw what he had made and behold, it was very good? I mean, yeah, this is not an idea that's going to fit very well with biblical literalists. There are, of course, varying theological views, interpretations of why God allows theodicy. This, in fact, is not one of them, but you can encounter this in your readings, perhaps. But moving right along here, there's basically two groups of Christians in my discussion today. Conservative Christians who reject evolution for three reasons. Because, of course, evolution, common ancestry, is not compatible with a biblical special creationism. They don't like the idea of the loss of a personal God. If God is working through created laws, then God is much less personal, and that to them is a real loss. It's too close to deism. And then, of course, the issue of theodicy. Now, mainstream Christians are not biblical literalists, but they still have difficulties with the idea of the loss of a personal God and of the theodicy problem. Because think about it, if God created the world using the process of evolution by natural selection, he's got a mean streak. I mean, there's some real either he has a mean streak or there's some other way that you have to deal with this from a theological standpoint. Now, just as there is often a gap between scientists and the general public, between what scientists accept the data show about things like evolution or global climate change or even vaccination, so is there also often a gap between Christian theologians and the people in the pews. Like I say, leaders like the Church of England, Archbishop Rowan Williams is uncompromising toward creationism, considering it a ridiculous theology that people should give up right away. Clearly he has a very different view toward evolution than many of his fellow Christians who are conservative Christians. People like the Catholic theologian John Haught reprised a version of Theodosius Dobzhansky's famous aphorism, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." John has said on more than one occasion, "Nothing in theology makes sense except in the light of evolution." He has used evolution as a basis for his view of Catholic theology. And in fact, there is quite a large literature of Christian theology dealing with the relationship between evolution and Christian faith, from mostly Catholic and mainstream Protestant, but also from some evangelicals, such as Dennis Lamoureux's perspective on evolution from a evangelical perspective. Interesting stuff. Well, back to the theme of the conference, the hazards of living in a religious world. Indeed, due to pressure from creationists, there have been a large number of bills introduced into legislatures around the country this year, last year, and previous years. You've heard about some of those. You probably have not heard very much about pressures by conservative Christians on schools and school districts to institute creationist or anti-evolution positions, policies. You very rarely ever hear about the pressure against individual teachers, which is the latter two categories being categories that NCSE deals with a lot in our sort of everyday. So I'm acutely aware of the fact that the teaching of evolution, at least, can be hazardous in some kinds of religious worlds. But I think it misunderstands history, and it misunderstands the complexity of the present variation or variety within Christianity to believe that the relationship between science and religion, between religion and evolution, is somehow unidirectional. Certainly, there is a long tradition in mainstream Christianity where science influences the interpretation of religion, where Christian theologians have looked at science, including evolution, and have concluded that, we're going to have to see how our religious views accords with what is, in the opinion of all of us, empirical reality. Now, personally, I think I'm not a person of faith, and so I don't really care a whole lot about this, but on the whole, I think this is much more positive than the alternative. And indeed, there is an alternative in which religion comes first and influences the science. And of course, we have plenty of examples of that in creation science and intelligent design. Henry Moore is saying, the Word of God must take first priority, and secondly, the observed facts of science is, to my mind, doing great violence to science and something that we simply cannot countenance, and particularly not in science education. So I was asked to give a brief speech tonight, so I will. And so let me just direct you to where you can find more information on this and related topics, particularly in the creationism and evolution controversy. If you go to ncse.com and you go to this news alerts button, you can receive every Friday a free electronic newsletter that will bring you up to date into what's going on. If you go to this news button up here, you'll be taken to our news page, and you can search in various ways. You can search for California or any other state. You can search for years. If you have a child or grandchild who's writing a term paper, this is a good place to come. You can find an awful lot of information on this. Similarly, we are a membership organization, so clearly we would very much encourage you to join if you believe that this cause is important. Like all good nonprofits, we of course have a Facebook page. You can find the National Center for Science Education on Facebook, and even I, alas, am on Facebook. We have a YouTube site which has a lot of very good videos, far too many of me. Those aren't necessarily the good videos. In this clip was a symposium that we had a number of years ago at the American Association for the Advancement of Science meeting, and Steve Gould is holding up what I believe is the world's best biological bumper sticker. It says, "Honk if you understand punctuated equilibrium." Now, this elicited a chuckle in this room. If this was a group of biologists, you'd be on the floor. But you know, that's what you get for having obscure bumper stickers. My colleagues at the National Center for Science Education include Glenn Branch, whom many of you know. He puts out that wonderful electronic newsletter every Friday. Robert Lunn is our communications director. Peter Hess is our faith community outreach director. And our wonderful flare-ups wranglers, Josh Rosenow and Steve Newton, are the people who answer the phone when you elect the wrong school board, shall we say. And they are the ones who provide the bulk of the information. We all do, of course. And Eric Mickle is our education director. And if you want to be my Facebook friend, please go to facebook.com, eugenie.scott, and like me. I mean, this is so weird for a person from Wisconsin. You know, I mean, I have a fan page. Come on, you're not supposed to have fans if you're from Wisconsin. This is, you know, I really was born in Lake Wobegon, and you know, there's just something sort of creeps me out. But I had too many friends on my friend page, so I had to do a fan page. But anyway, this is where I update. So if you want to get updates, you have to go there. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of your session, and I apologize for the electronics.
Big hand for you, Genie. Thank you, Genie, very much.